Welcome to the DebateDrills Academy Public Forum topic analysis on the NSA surveillance topic, which was recently announced for the upcoming month. In this topic analysis, I'm going to go through several of the key terms in this resolution, discuss some background for NSA surveillance, and then finally conclude with some positions that can be run on both the pro and con sides of the resolution. So, for starters, some key terminology can help elucidate the meaning behind this resolution. So, resolved, the National Security Agency should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. Surveillance of U.S. citizens is a phrase that we're going to discuss in the following slide, since there's a little bit more background that needs to be had to be able to have a full discussion of that. But the other terms we can start by defining. The National Security Agency, commonly abbreviated the NSA, is the intelligence agency in the U.S. Department of Defense. The NSA is tasked with collecting information about potential threats to national security, and conducting surveillance is generally the agency that is tasked with conducting surveillance. So when you read about collection that is taking place, it is almost always with the NSA. So the NSA has become newsworthy in recent years with the 2013 Edward Snowden revelations. They were collecting data on Americans fairly indiscriminately, just covering everybody regardless of cause. So when you read about that, that's really what the NSA is doing. So this should be a concept that is fairly familiar. The groups affected in the resolution are U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, so citizens and the non-citizens who are permanently able to live here. Notably, this does not include foreign surveillance, or non-Americans who may be temporarily in the country, or people who are outside of the U.S. This becomes relevant because it may result in a distinction between foreign intelligence and intelligence that is collected on people in the United States, since a lot of the literature does talk about collection on those who are not necessarily American, such as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. But more on that in a little bit when we talk about the definition of surveillance. So what is surveillance? Surveillance is obtaining information without express consent, or the process of being able to monitor other people to try to collect information about them. Note the emphasis on without express consent. So typically, when people discuss obtaining information via traditional means, there is a need to obtain a warrant. Constitutionally, you have a right to have your information not necessarily be obtained unless you've given your consent, or if the government has been able to obtain a warrant that demonstrates there is some overarching reason that your information does need to be transferred. So, for example, there's probable cause that a crime was committed, may be enough reason for them to obtain your information with a warrant from the government, even without your consent. In the digital age, what makes things different is that oftentimes your information can be collected automatically, and it may just be difficult to obtain a warrant. So, for example, if you carry out a phone call and Verizon is able to have information about who you called and pass that along to the NSA, the process of obtaining a direct warrant for that would be tricky and likely is not something that would happen. So, surveillance in a broad strokes understanding is just the obtaining of information without express consent, in this context, particularly over digital media such as telephone calls, email, social media, etc. So there are a couple of important programs that we should discuss. The first is metadata. These are the records of calls that are made in the United States. So a service provider, such as, so you take a service provider such as, for example, Verizon, AT&T, etc., and you then have them pass along information surrounding metadata. They pass along that information to the NSA. So every call record that is taken, they will have access to in some form, and they can pass that along to the government. Second is PRISM. This, in contrast to metadata, which is fundamentally about telephone calls, this is information that is passed along through emails or social media information, so think Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., which are obtained through those social media companies. So an email log that you send may be kept by Google, and a message that you send via Twitter may be kept by Twitter, and then obtained by the government through those companies. So an important point of emphasis here is that this is what's known as bulk data, which is information that is collected indiscriminately, as opposed to targeted. So targeted data would be saying, Joe Smith is somebody that we suspect may be involved in this terrorist plot. We're going to tap his phones, and we are going to collect information that he sent over email. In contrast, bulk data may just collect everybody's data indiscriminately and screen through it with certain keywords, such as I'm not sure, let's say backpack and pressure cooker to see if someone is trying to create a homemade device. They'll look for certain keywords, and then if they see those keywords, they may monitor more closely. So that is surveillance. To understand surveillance, though, it's important to understand the legal context behind it and what some of the important events have been in terms of authorizing surveillance. So, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 allows the collection of data on, quote, foreign powers and, quote, agents of foreign powers. This is seen by many as the wellspring of what has allowed surveillance and the NSA's power to really continue, or to even begin. That data was able to be collected on foreign entities who the US suspected as maybe posing some type of security risk. This could happen within the geographic boundaries of the United States, so if there were foreign powers that were operating in the United States, or perhaps abroad, to be able to pick up on potential terrorist threats or other security issues. However, in 2008, there was an important amendment, which is known as or an important law known as the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. Here, what's called Section 702 was added. This is important, as many have viewed this as massively expanding the scope of FISA. Previously, FISA was understood primarily to be about foreign intelligence, so collecting information on those that were operating in the US or perhaps outside of the US, but critically, not American citizens, foreign powers. So, Section 702 does not technically authorize the collection of data of Americans, but it does have a couple of distinctions, which are important, especially for understanding this topic's limit on collecting data on American citizens and permanent non-residents. It allows what's called about collection and what's called incidental collection. What these involve are basically what this refers to is when information about somebody who may be an American citizen is caught in the mix, even if it is not the direct intention of what they were trying to collect, that can still be included. So let's think of this via an example. The person I gave the example of before, Joe Smith, this time they are an American citizen, and they are talking with their friend Rebecca Smith, who is also a terrorist. But Rebecca lives on the other side of the world and is not an American citizen. But Joe Smith is an American citizen, and they are discussing issues that would relate to terror and be of interest to the NSA jointly. The information under FISA that can be legally collected initially would have been the person outside of the United States who is not an American citizen. So in this case, Rebecca. However, Joe his information is still involved in this. He's a direct intermediary here, which means that under about collection or incidental collection, this information is still liable to be picked up because it was part of the regular intercourse of information that was being spread concerning something that is of interest to American national security. So, Section 702 means that, from the standpoint of this topic, information about non citizens, about non permanent residents, about foreign entities that have no real connection to the US except talking to somebody in the US, there are ways that could be fair ground for either the pro or the con to affect. Because if Section 702 allows the surveillance of people that are not necessarily American citizens or non permanent residents, that would mean that potential positions could argue that as a result of limiting surveillance of Americans, that would likely also result in the limiting of data that is collected much more broadly, because that might limit incidental collection, which then would revert the FISA back to a much narrower version of itself. More on that when we talk about potential positions on each side. So, some other important history. In 2013, there was the Edward Snowden leak. Edward Snowden was a contractor for Booz Allen Hamilton who was working on information that was collected by the NSA, and he unveiled a lot of classified information that unveiled the existence of the metadata program and basically mass data collection that is fairly indiscriminate and not targeted. Programs that we didn't know existed, that we decided were probably illegal, were actually occurring despite us not knowing about them. So this created a massive scandal. He fled to Russia. Some have thought of him as a whistleblower and a hero, others as a traitor who has committed treason. Regardless of what your views are on Snowden, he certainly did have an impact in terms of the debates over surveillance and really brought to the forefront of public attention many of the issues surrounding NSA and what their data collection looks like. So this brings us to now. There have been some limited reforms in the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations, particularly due to political backlash, but ultimately, Most of the status quo is what it looked like before Snowden's revelations. Some small reforms have happened at the margins, but for the most part, Section 702 and programs continue with information that's being collected about us, and ultimately, we just don't know what we don't know. There is always the potential for broader programs to persist. But the too long didn't read version of this is that the main types of surveillance that will be relevant for this topic most likely will concern metadata, PRISM, and generally bulk, indiscriminate collection, and the divide between foreign surveillance and American surveillance is fuzzy at best because of the idea of incidental data collection being permitted under an ostensibly foreign statute, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So let's talk about some casing on both sides of the resolution. For the pro side, one potential position is a position about privacy. Americans have a right not to be searched without a warrant. This is probably the most intuitive and stock approach you can take to the topic. This is what a lot of the articles are about when you look at sources such as the Brennan Center, the ACLU, and the people who work there. Their fundamental issue is about Fourth Amendment issues and potentially even First Amendment issues concerning the ability for people to exist without unjust government interference and the ability to have their information not necessarily be taken indiscriminately by the government. So there are a couple of ways that impacts or various scenarios can be reached for this position. So one scenario could just be about shoring up Fourth Amendment protections more broadly. So this scenario likely would talk about how a broader understanding of privacy is important for various impacts such as American soft power, American leadership, democracy, etc. And the benefit of this is that you are often able to get advantages about precedent when you defend, say, some type of likely court ruling resulting from the resolution or some other type of spillover from the resolution being implemented. So in a way this could be constructed potentially would argue that suppose the NSA were to all of a sudden limit their use of their collection of data on Americans. That makes the Fourth Amendment much more resilient and has other knock-on effects on other types of surveillance, other types of privacy violations, and just contributes to a much hardier Fourth Amendment, which as a result would be much more likely to reduce concerns relating to American democracy. If there are certainly authors out there that talk about the effects that privacy violations and rights violations have on democracy or American leadership. An alternative scenario is about international law and about cooperation. In particular, Europe has much stricter privacy laws than we do, which has posed issues for a number of American companies, such as Google, that have been trying to do business in Europe, but have found that Europe is imposing much more onerous constraints on what information they're allowed to collect, and also whether or not affirmative consent needs to be obtained for a lot of the information they're collecting on their users. So a number of authors write about the problems harmonizing US privacy standards with European privacy standards, and there's been discussion of a privacy shield in recent years, that being able to have similar policies, or more specifically, reducing data collection, could just be an olive branch that allows the harmonization of data across Europe and the US, which can have better effects on business, on trade, etc. Many benefits that come with harmonization. Another position may, on face, seem backwards, but actually is very interesting, which is making arguments about terrorism on the pro side. So typically, when many people think of terrorism, they think of arguments on the con side. It is a reason for more data collection, because we have to find the terrorists who likely are going to do bad things, finding information about them, who they're calling, what their plots are, etc., is essential. But there are a lot of compelling pro cards that are written about the risk of information overload, or more specifically, that we're just collecting too much data indiscriminately and have no way to find it. It's not just a needle in a haystack, it's a needle within hundreds and hundreds of millions of haystacks, and we're just adding more hay constantly, which makes it difficult to obtain information. And even while we're trying to just sort through it, we're unable to really keep up. That it's better to have a shift to what's called human intelligence, or individual people investigating leads, doing targeted searches. And one of the nice things about the ways this resolution is worded is that the pro side can really claim to be striking a middle ground and threading the needle. They can claim that they don't foreclose all surveillance, they just would require targeted surveillance against people who are not American citizens. That Collection of foreign intelligence or more targeted searches can continue, but it's about bulk surveillance that just lumps Americans indiscriminately into the mix that really contributes to the problem. So now let's talk about some con casing. So one important thing is to establish the scope of the pro's position. If the pro's argument is that they only limit collection of data on Americans, it will on face be difficult for you to get a lot of offense, because a lot of cards will be about the importance of broad FISA authorities, broad Section 702 authority to collect data on potential foreign adversaries, which on face the pro doesn't link to, because their argument is you can collect data on foreign parties to an unlimited extent. Just don't lump American citizens or permanent residents into the mix. However, what's important then is to establish that the line between American citizens and the data of foreign entities is intentionally very fuzzy. That because of the about/incidental data collection distinction, information about Americans often does get folded in automatically if people are talking to Americans. And there are a lot of very good cards out there that say this distinction is fuzzy. We need to be collecting more data, not less. So giving the NSA the flexibility to ensure they can collect data through Section 702 authorities, through FISA authorities, etc., without imposing ex ante limits on what types of data they can receive from whom is important. So as a result, no matter what position you're going for on the con, it will be important for you to read evidence that does in fact talk about making sure that there is flexibility for the NSA, the ability to have incidental collection of American data as part of that, and not imposing restrictions. So you should read evidence that they have to limit Section 702. So the first position is probably the most intuitive, which is the terrorism dissad. We need to ensure we can collect data on potential threats to foil plots. Collecting all of the data is necessary, and if we just don't collect some of it, it's likely that information will slip through the cracks. There is obvious tension between this and the position I outlined for the pro side about information overload, so to resolve this debate, you will want to read good cards that were able to handle the data just fine. We foiled several terrorist plots, so one statistic says that we foiled between 49 and 54 terrorist plots as a result of this data, so evidence that talks about that, and generally the need to have a more expansive catalog of information about potential terrorist threats. And remember, you need to have a reason why American data is key here. So arguments about how the interplay between Americans and foreign entities who are discussing terrorist plots, you need to be able to collect the data about the Americans to have that incidental collection take place. Another potential, although less intuitive, position is the FBI disadvantage, that the FBI relies on being able to use 702 data and conduct queries through their software that necessarily has to include information about Americans. There are a lot of very strong cards written by people within the FBI and the intelligence community that talk about how the sharing between the NSA and the FBI has been useful for solving domestic and foreign problems. So people talk about a wall that was erected between the FBI and relevant security entities that allowed information about 9/11 to slip through. Similarly, the FBI, to conduct its operations effectively, needs to be able to have extensive information about threats in the US and abroad, but also notably foreign entities that are operating with connections in the United States who may, in fact, be American citizens. So being able to have full information about those people is critical, and the pros, just broad strokes limit, may prevent that from happening. They just use a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel, getting rid of all of the relevant information that could, in fact, be necessary. Another position is definitively more legal focused, but could still be of use, which is the state secrets disadvantage. So legal doctrine, known as the state secrets doctrine, basically gives the government extensive privilege over information related to national security. And when you impose limitations on what organizations are able to do, that will likely have effects on precedent and also may have effects in terms of further litigation. So the actor in this resolution is the National Security Agency. If they were to all of a sudden stop collecting data and offer a justification of this is something that we view as illegal, there would almost certainly be litigation that comes up as a result. Or even perhaps in future cases, it may be cited that the NSA restrained itself from collecting further data. The potential deleterious effects on on its own power or on the state secrets doctrine, which protects the ability for the government to have certain confidential information, could potentially be notable. So reasons why the government should be able to act with secrecy, well, that everything being out in the open could make the basis for another position. Another position that is also worth looking into is the Five Eyes disadvantage. The Five Eyes Alliance is a group of countries spread out across the world that work with the United States to conduct surveillance together and cooperate in terms of pinpointing potential security threats. What really underpins that relationship, however, is the ability for the countries to share data openly with each other. And honestly, the majority of the data does come from the United States, since the US does have arguably the strongest surveillance apparatus. Because of the hugely expansive nature of the pro side, cutting off all types of information about Americans, citizens, and permanent residents, there would likely be a substantial reduction in data that is shared with the Five Eyes allies, and notably, many of them have claimed they do find importance to Section 702 and being able to get incidental collection of data on Americans. So reducing that could potentially diminish the relationship. And you can find evidence about some of the benefits of the relationship for deterring China, stopping terror attacks, and general US alliance cohesion. The final position is the targeted reform counterplan. So, while the pro side takes really a sledgehammer and just eliminates all types of data collection on American citizens and permanent residents, the con does have the option of using much more of a scalpel and a much more targeted, deliberate approach that instead reduces the amount of data, but not enough to trigger some of the disadvantages associated with the pro side. So in particular, one option would just be to limit surveillance of American citizens to those situations in which there is reasonable cause that the person is associated with a terrorist organization or is somehow up to something that could pose a security threat. And there are several authors that define what types of security threats would warrant further surveillance. So in this case, you would avoid many of the disadvantages because you don't endorse a wholesale rejection of surveillance, but instead the result is a diminishment of surveillance, but enough to avoid some of the problems the pro has claimed, but not necessarily so many that you trigger the disadvantages. So, in conclusion, I want to leave you all with 2 points. First, both sides need to control what limitations look like and how far these limitations go. The resolution is written in a somewhat vague way, in that surveillance on Americans can mean a lot of things, and whether or not this can include Section 702 or incidental collection of data on Americans is ultimately up for debate. Establishing at the get-go how expansive the pro side is and what they link to is going to be important. Because if you go for a disadvantage about Section 702 being needed to combat terrorism, and they say we don't touch 702, we only limit direct targeted surveillance of Americans, not incidental information, then you might be stuck. And second, and relatedly, it is all about whether or not the pro is a tailored restriction or a broader alteration. A much more tailored restriction has the benefit for the pro of linking to less con offense, but on the flip side, it also diminishes the scope of solvency, or how many benefits that can accrue to the pro side, just because of the limited nature of their restriction. In contrast, a broader alteration gives the pro side the benefit of potentially solving more and getting to criticize more of the status quo security apparatus, but on the flip side, also gives the con much more offense. Either way, this topic should make for some interesting debates, and thank you for watching.